All right, so welcome everybody. Just before we get started, I'd just like to introduce myself. My name is Sam Shankland. I'm a Grandmaster from California. I've played several times on the U.S. Olympic team, including our last gold medal at the Baku Olympiad. I also got an individual gold medal in Norway. And so I've been coming to the St. Louis Chess Club for many, many years. I played my first U.S. championship here in 2009. Now we're here 9 years later, and I'm back. And at this point, I've actually just come out with my first book called Small Steps to Giant Improvements, Master Pawn Play in Chess. And the book has not yet been released to the general public, but I'm giving a pre-release lecture here where you can buy the book and I will sign it for you. And you get it early. You don't have to pay shipping. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what the book is covering. It's all about pawn play, and the key premise is that pawns do not move backwards. Now, this is something that everybody knows, but it's something that is very important to remind us of. Now, pawns represent half of the chess men you are awarded at the beginning of the game. You must play with them well, or else things will not go your way. So in order to demonstrate a little bit about what I mean, I'd like to start by talking about this position here. Does anybody recognize it? It's an infamous position. All right, so this is a game from, it's Kasparov Polgar from 1994. And so black here, Kasparov picked up his knight on d7 and placed it on c5. And then there's some controversy as to what happened next. I think that what officially happened according to the actual video was he released the knight for such a small fraction of a second that even he wouldn't know. Of course, this move simply walks straight into bishop c6 because the rook on c2 no longer defends this square, and the rook on e8 will be lost. The ruling was that Kasparov had obviously touched his knight, but the tournament director didn't have instant replay at the time. He ruled that he had not actually released the knight, that he still had his fingers on it when it was on the c5 square. He would have to move the knight, but knight c5 would not be a forced move. Had knight c5 been played, bishop c6 happens, and this bishop is hitting both the queen and the rook. And Kasparov, who was just up a healthy pawn, is now losing material. Later in his annotations, Kasparov gave queen g4, suggesting that this is a draw. It is not. After bishop takes e8, white is winning. Kasparov said that after knight c4, that white has enough, that black here has enough counterplay because the queen on d6 is hit, knight f2 is coming, and white cannot actually take this knight with anything because if he takes with the knight on e4, there'll come queen g2 mate. If he takes with the rook on e4, there'll come queen d1 mate. None of this will work, but white has a nice winning shot. First, bishop takes f7 check, king takes f7, and now this very strong move, queen takes b6, guarding the f2 square so that knight to f2 doesn't come. Black can try taking this knight. Now, a maximalist will actually realize that white can just force mate with the move rook to a1 here, but if you don't actually see that, there's nothing wrong with queen d6 check, simply grabbing the knight on d2. White ends up material to the good and is just winning. Queen h4 instead would have been a draw. Because after bishop takes e8 and knight g4, the threat on h3 is quite hard to deal with. The threat on g2 is hard to deal with because if h3, black can go knight f2 check and then knight takes h3, or knight g4 check, and he will have a perpetual at his disposal. Now, you might say, well, what is the relevance of all this? We're getting to that shortly. The ruling was Kasparov had to move his knight. So he realizes that knight c5 is a bad idea. He goes knight to f8. Now, a lot has been discussed about this game in terms of what was the ruling on the touch move. Was it appropriate? Was the result right? Should something have been changed? Did the arbiter screw up? Did the players screw up? Did Kasparov lie through his teeth, or was he just mistaken? None of that really matters to me at all. What I found interesting was the key point we see next. Polgar plays knight to e4. Now, what should black play here? This is a very important move and a very important concept to understand. Any thoughts? I'm going to go forward. The best move is to, put your tail between your legs, admit you made a mistake, and play knight back to d7. You don't have to be a world champion to realize that knight to f8 was a mistake. But to err is human, we all know that. But when you place a piece on a bad square and in some way hinder your position, there is no rule at all saying that you cannot just take that move right back and put the piece right back where it came from once you've realized this move was incorrect. With pawns, you do not get this luxury. At this point, black is still better, and he went on to win a nice game. Let's move on to see what happens when you make a similar kind of mistake with a pawn. Moving forward many years, this is actually one of my games from 2012. I was defending this queen endgame. I had the white pieces against a very strong German grandmaster, Georg Meier. Now, looking back, it really pains me the way I played this position. So the whole premise is pawns not move backwards. I believe there are 5 specific reasons that you may wish your pawn could move backwards, but you find that it cannot. They are in order. First, the pawn is simply vulnerable. It has gone too far into the enemy's position. It can no longer be defended. It will be surrounded and captured, or at least harassed. Second, it has released control of a key square that you would like to be controlling. This will be frequently seen when your opponent has a nice outpost that they're using and you cannot kick their piece off of it because your pawn has been pushed too far. It can also be blocking your own pieces. A very frequent example, one I've seen in this book, is for anyone who plays the Sicilian Dragon or the Grunfeld or anything like this, you know that the g7 bishop is the pride of your position. If you ever play the move f6, you're blunting your bishop, and you will always, basically always, be wanting to play this move f6 back to f7 to open that bishop up. That's why f6 is a strategic mistake in such positions. Fourth and fifth reasons. Fourth is it can compromise your king safety. This is very basic. You want, especially in the middle game, to have pawns around your king so that he is safe from any kind of attack. Now, and then the last reason is that it can make a hook in the position. Let's see what happens here when I made a bad pawn move that I could not take back, the way Kasparov could sort of take back his knight move. Yes, it came at the cost of 2 tempi. So at this point, I'm defending a queen endgame 1 pawn down, but black's pawn structure is fractured. There are very few pawns left on the board. My king is well placed. I don't have any immediate weaknesses. This definitely should be a draw, and it should not be a super difficult draw either. All I had to do was essentially do nothing. Any old move will draw. Let's say queen d4 looks most natural to me, just to, I guess, sort of eye the f6 pawn. It doesn't really matter. But I was scared of some kind of plan with black playing king g6 to f5 and eventually getting his king into the game, perhaps in conjunction with a move like queen h1 check, and then his king can come even further into g4. And if something like that happened, I thought actually black will have winning chances, and I could end up losing. So my goal to prevent that was to play the move f5. So this move is multi-purpose. It is cutting black off from access to the g6 square, so the black king cannot enter the position by the route we just described, but it does allow him to play king h6 to g5. And I had calculated a variation. My point was, next move, no matter what black plays, I'm going to put my queen on f4. And at this point, there is just no way the black king will ever enter my position. And I calculated one key variation, that if black plays queen h1 check, king f1, and now queen c1, which seems like a strong move to prevent me from playing queen f4, because that would trade down into a pawn endgame, then black is ready to come with king h6 next. This is another thing that I think is very important to know for all chess players. It's not really the subject of the book, but it's always something I think we should be saying, is if you have a key positional idea, in this case white playing queen f4 to shut out the black king, and your opponent prevents you from doing so, in this case by black playing queen c1, the first question you should always ask yourself is, what happens if I just do it anyway? Here we find out queen f4 is just a draw. It's not especially difficult to calculate. After takes, let's say, if black tries to bring his king to support the pawn, we notice that after king g3, black cannot play king to i5 because the board ends. i5 does not exist. The board ends at the h file. And at this point, there's no way for the black king to support his pawn further. Much more challenging is if black brings the king back, trying to bring it all the way around to bring the king around to d6 and e4 and take my pawns while I'm distracted by the h pawn. But this is very straightforward calculation, move for move, one at a time. There's no variations to calculate. There's no side anything. You just get all the way up here. You realize this is just a draw. All the pawns are traded. King takes f4, king takes f6, and then whatever he does, this is a draw. Similarly, you can take on f5 first, but after taking on f7, you will not be able to take my f4 pawn without losing f6. I calculated this all reasonably well. But of course, my opponent came up with a move. He immediately rattled off a move that I hadn't even considered, which was very powerful, queen to g1. Now, what has happened is he wants to play the exact same variation, except after queen f4, he will play queen f1 check, and queen takes f4. Here we have the exact same position, except my king is on e3, not f2. As a result, I am one tempo down on this key variation. After king f8, king f2, king e7, king g3, king d6, king h4. We take all this, I go after the pawns, and I lose by one move. Actually, here king g7 might be a draw, but take this pawn is just winning. It's just over. So you could say that he's outcalculated me, although I think queen g1 is a reasonably simple move. In any case, at this point, it happens that my whole ploy with queen f4 has failed. And then I realized, what, I've just put my pawn on f5. I have made a giant weakness in my position that's very easy for him to attack with both his queen and his king when previously I had no weaknesses. Well, let me pull a Kasparov and bring my pawn back to f4 and admit my mistake. That's not going to happen. This is why pawn play is extremely punishing, and that's why I've decided to write a book on it. You really want to make sure that you're pushing your pawns correctly. Whenever you push your pawn, you're making a weakness. Whenever you push your pawn, you're closing a line. You're also opening lines and potentially probing for your opponent's weaknesses. Now, you might be scared of pushing pawns, but trust me, you will never make it very far as a chess player by only playing knight f3, knight c3, rook b1, rook g1. You clearly have to push pawns at some point in the game to make any kind of progress. Striking this balance is tough, and this is what the book is about. Now, here as it happens, queen f4 actually is a draw, but it's quite tough to calculate, and at this point we're looking at only moves. And I was putting myself in a position where I have to calculate very complicated variations, only moves, when realistically I could have just started making moves and hitting the clock if I had not played f5 and nothing really to worry about. After queen f1 check, it turns out that this variation is still a draw. Okay, king f2 is fine. But white has to take a completely different route, and instead of going after black's pawn, simply try to box black's king out by maintaining the opposition. Now he's able to do so after a move like king d5. The only move is king h5, keeping the distant opposition. This is sort of endgame stuff and largely outside the scope of what I'm hoping to discuss, but it's sort of the main point here is that making this big pawn weakness forced me to be finding only moves and calculating accurate variations in a position that really should have been an easy draw that I could train my golden retriever to do if I needed to. Instead, I put myself in a spot where I had to find some good moves. Right when you do that, it's very hard psychologically to recover. I was a young player at the time, and I did not do so. I sort of, out of inertia, played queen d2, just trying to sort of box out black's queen, and then, of course, eyeing the h6 square so that he can't get through. And already, after queen f1 check, my f5 pawn is simply dropping. There was nothing I could do about it. Queen f2 leads to a lost pawn endgame because black's king gets to g5 before I can come to f4. So I tried king e4, but after queen c4 check, I'm losing the pawn by force. Once again, queen d4 leads to a lost pawn ending. If king f3, he has queen g4 check. And if king e3 as I played, he has queen c5 check. And if I try to stay in touch with the pawn with king f4 or king e4, queen e5 check will come. Ultimately, my f5 pawn is lost, and it's lost just a few moves after I so foolishly pushed it to f5. Now, as soon as this position came after queen g1, and I realized I couldn't play queen f4, I immediately regretted my decision to play f5. And of course, f5 was a mistake. But the problem is, like we were saying, pawns do not move backwards, and these create long-lasting permanent problems. So, when we break down the reasons, the 5 that I've described, the pawn is weak, you're no longer controlling a key square, you're blocking lines for your pieces, you have loosened your king's cover, or you have made a hook in the position. It should be pretty obvious which of those 5 reasons is the one that this move f5 was the wrong move. Which one is that? Sorry?
It's too far.
Yeah, it's too far advanced, but there were 5 reasons that the pawn could be too far advanced that I've just described. Which of those 5 reasons?
It's too far into your opponent's camp.
Yes, that's the whole thing, but it can be too far into your opponent's camp for any number of reasons. And the question is, why is it too far? Exactly. The pawn is vulnerable. It's not like I've lost control of a key square or I've blocked my pieces. It's just simply this pawn is hard to defend now when it was easy to defend before. But there are all sorts of other reasons. And I'd like to move on to a game played quite recently where a very strong player fell victim to a similar kind of thing. So, anybody recognize this position? Just a few days ago, yes. Yes. Aronian was playing white against Kramnik here. And so he played a very innocent-looking pawn move that I believe completely lost him the game. I mean, I don't think he necessarily has to resign after playing this move, but his position becomes very, very difficult. And it is because he pushed a pawn that he later wished he could move backwards. So Aronian played the move h3. Now, it's hard to imagine this being a losing move because, come on, it's just making luft for the king, it's controlling the g4 square, it's doing all these useful things. But for one of these 5 reasons, the pawn is too far forward. Yes, sir? Exactly. Reason number 5, this move has created a hook. Who knows what a hook is? A hook is a pawn that can be attacked and that cannot move again. So as such, lines will open if another pawn attacks it. This is mostly relevant in closed positions where you're better on one side of the board and worse on the other. You want to avoid making hooks on the side in which you're worse. But in open positions, it can matter too. By playing h3, white has opened himself up to a very simple plan from black to play g5, g4. This will force open white's king side. It will compromise his pawn's defenses. He will have fewer defenders. There will be open lines. And indeed, Kramnik simply played the move rook g8. Now, this seems like almost a beginner move, a mysterious rook move, but his point is very simple. He's going to play g5, g4, and he's going to give mate. And there's basically nothing white can do about it. What white would love to do is say, you know what, I'd like to just play h3 to h2 here, thank you very much. So now that you cannot open these lines to my king, and furthermore, you've played this silly rook g8 and you cannot castle, and there's no reason for you to play rook g8 if g5, g4 doesn't mate me. Unfortunately, after h3, we've seen that pawns do not move backwards. So Aronian played king h1. I think his point was that if he makes a normal developing move, say knight c3, that black is able to play g5, because if white takes the pawn, black has bishop takes h3. And after g takes h3, I guess h6 is probably the easiest. And the point is, black is down a piece for the moment, but this bishop on g5 is pinned. It will be captured. And then black will be ready to play g5, g4 again, or potentially switch over to the h file with a very strong attack incoming. So Aronian tried king h1, but this was a futile attempt. g5, it's not like white can stop it. So in the correspondence games in the computer, black was always playing h6. This may well be the best move, but what Kramnik played doesn't offend me in any way. He played knight h5. So his plan is to play g5, g4. This should be reasonably straightforward. And he's pointing out that the queen now controls the g5 square as well. If you were to play g5 here, we see Aronian's point with king h1 is after bishop takes g5. There's no way to punish white for this, because after bishop takes h3, gh, h6 no longer wins a piece since the king is not on g1 anymore, and white can simply save his bishop and remain a piece to the good. So, but by playing knight h5, black is ready for g5 next. White tried c3, but this is a bit slow. After g5, white played knight takes e5, exploiting the tactical energy in the position, pointing out that first of all, if the queen were to recapture here, white can take the knight on h5. He can play d4 to win the piece back, like say takes. After d4, black has a lot of hanging pieces and will lose a bunch of material. And opening the center is a good way to punish black for trying to play on the king side. But unfortunately, Kramnik just went straight through with g4. And there's really nothing to be done about black opening the king side. And I don't really want to show the rest of this game just because I think a whole bunch of other people are going to be showing it in the next few days if they haven't already. I also think it's somewhat outside the scope of what I'm hoping to discuss. The real point was that this move h3 turned out to be white's undoing, and it turned out to be so very, very early in the game. And I've listed several guidelines in my book as to how to avoid making poor pawn moves like this. So the way the book works is I've taken all 5 of these reasons that a pawn may want to move backwards, and I have dedicated a chapter to each of them on avoiding having this kind of scenario come up in your own games. And obviously, you know, we're only talking about hooks in this one. I guess you could argue this sort of fits in with loosening the king's cover. But then again, just as much as avoiding losing in chess, because let's say in this case you've made poor pawn moves, there's also winning chess games. Now, people make poor pawn moves all the time, as Aronian have clearly demonstrated. Look, the guy is on +1 in the candidates tournament right now. He's obviously an absurdly strong player. He's been well over 2,800 before. It's not like, you know, he's some idiot who made a bad pawn move. He's a very, very strong player who made a bad pawn move. And that's what you should be trying to exploit when it happens. However, you'll find that more often than not, people don't just make stupid pawn moves on their own. They often need some encouragement and often even more directly, force. So I'd like to talk about a game that I played now. This was, and this is on the same concept of hooks and king safety. So this is a position I got against Swedish Grandmaster Jonny Hector at the Politiken Cup in 2016. At this point, I was still in my preparation, and I believed that white is slightly better because he has a big center. The problem is, like any Slav player will know, you have a very solid position. It's hard to actually suggest an active plan for white to improve his game. What I had prepared was the move a6, or sorry, excuse me, a6 was played. I had prepared for c5, which is black's attempt to immediately break down my center. And if I recall, my preparation was to play knight b5, because if he retreats the bishop, I think d5 is very strong. And the main line of my preparation was knight takes e4, knight takes d6, knight d6, dc5, knight c4, and knight c4. And at the end of all this, black is unable to take the pawn on c5 on account of bishop d6 when I take an exchange. And at the end of all this, I'm going to put the knight on d6. It's not that impressive because black can play knight d5 back, and he's got a decent bishop and opposite bishops on the board. But I thought white was somewhat better here when he's going to get this outposted knight on d6, blocking the d file, and potentially attack the b7 pawn. In any case, that's what I had come up with before the game. But the guy played a6, which struck me as a slow move. It's clear it's not a stupid move. It's not like he's made a whole ton of weaknesses. It's not like this a pawn suddenly wants to move back to a7. I'd even argue it's a useful move. If black wants to play c5, and my goal is to play knight b5 next, he's stopped me from achieving that. In addition, he can also potentially prepare the move b7 to b5 to harass my pieces. So at this point, I was out of my preparation, and I had some idea of how these positions sort of worked, but I was quite happy with the move I came up with here. So white is slightly better for sure. He has more space, he's got active pieces, some lead in development, but there's really not much for him to actually do. A lead in development is a temporary advantage that will go away over time as your opponent develops their pieces. And the space advantage, if your opponent has good squares for all their pieces, it's not that important. And more importantly here, black is ready to break down my space advantage next move with c5. So white has a very strong move here. I'd like to see if anybody can suggest it. Okay, so that's a tactical resource. The point now is that e5 is going to come next, right? This is decent, but I did not think it was amazing. For example, if black plays rook takes f7 and say e5, or did you want to take on d6 first and only then play e5? Okay, so e5 and let's say bishop b8. E takes f6, rook takes f6. At this point, I think white's still slightly better, but I don't love the way the game has developed in the last few moves just because I think the space advantage is gone. Pieces have been exchanged. I think that kind of thing is sort of in black's favor. White has a little bit of pressure on the e6 pawn, but it should be easily alleviated. Black is ready to play bishop takes g3 next, bring his rook to e8 or f8, or even d8 to attack the d4 pawn. He can play knight d5 if needed. Probably white's a little better, but I think he has a stronger option. So, and remember, and while you should always be looking out for tactics at any moment, every moment in your game really, and you should be calculating key variations to try to achieve what you want to achieve, that is a little bit outside the scope of this book. So this is more about strategic play with pawns. So anybody else like to suggest a move?
F2, F4.
Okay, f4 was my first instinct, and it's not a bad idea at all. It is part of white's plan, but I do think it's inaccurate here. The problem is, after b5, black is getting a fair amount of counterplay, specifically because of one key point, which is that after c5, my whole goal was to always play d takes c5. And this has actually helped a lot when black plays b5, because a second ago here, it seems much harder for black to get the c5 advance in now that the pawn on b5 is hanging, right? But here he can play c5, and the big problem is that after dc, if bishop takes c5, check king h1, white is just better. He will probably just win this pawn on b5 without too much discussion. It's not the end of the story because the pawn on e4 is a little bit loose, but the real problem is that by playing f4 now, this bishop on g3 is blocked, which means that black can take on e5, forcing you to seriously compromise your structure. After knight d7, black will take back the pawn on c5. The pawn on e5 is now a weakness, and it seems like black has somewhat turned things around. I don't necessarily think he's better yet, but I think white has misplayed this a bit. So I'm going to go forward with the move I played, which was very strong. I played the move bishop h4. So this pins the knight to the queen. Let's say black were to play c5, continuing along with his plan to break down my center. What will white play now? After a knight to g4?
That's the like
yeah, around here black should consider resigning. He is absolutely dead. e5 is coming, and there is nothing to be done. If black were to play g5 now to try to break the pin, I have knight takes h6, check, and bishop takes g5. After knight g4, black is just done for. There is nothing else to do. He can stop the clocks. So knight g4 is a massive threat. Yes? Okay, black has some time to deal with it. It's not like I've played knight g4 yet. It's just, it's a threat. It's as if, someone attacks your queen, you deal with the threat like any others. Okay, how does black deal with the threat of knight g4? If queen d8, I think the other gentleman's tactical idea of knight takes f7 will be pretty devastating, because now the e6 pawn hangs at the end, and when that comes, there's going to be a pin on the rook. Queen d8 is also a very sad move in general. If you have to do it, you have to do it. You should not discard an ugly move just because it is ugly. Sometimes this is required.
Right, or you're going to play g5.
Yeah, that's what he played. Now, Jonny Hector's strong Swedish Grandmaster. Do you think he didn't know that g5 weakens his king? He was fully aware of all of that, for sure. The real point, I did not leave him any choice in the matter. After bishop h4, black must play g5 because he's going to get demolished next move. I mean, maybe he can try queen c7, but I believe after shattering the kingside pawn structure with a knight g4 coming and e5 is next, I'd be shocked if black can survive this. I think he will just get mated. So really, black had no choice but to play g5. Now I played bishop back to g3. Okay, on my last two moves, I have played bishop h4, bishop g3. Why doesn't black just play g5, g7, and offer me a draw? So do you want to repeat moves? This is the whole premise. Pawns do not... Exactly. Pawns do not move backwards. And it can be very much worthwhile to provoke an enemy pawn forward if it hinders their position in some way. Now, we've already discussed the 5 reasons that a pawn may want to move backward. Pawn is vulnerable. It is no longer controlling key squares. It is blocking your pieces. It has become a hook, or it compromises your king safety. Now, 2 of these 5 reasons are relevant here. Which 2 are they? That is true. What is the other truth to it? Yes, it is a hook. This pawn on g5, you a second ago suggested the move f4, which seemed pretty simple, gain space in the center and everything. Now when you play f4, you're going to blow up black's king and wake up that sleeping rook on f1. Right? When f4 comes, black will be unable to prevent white from opening the f-file towards his king and activating this last piece, the one piece of his that hasn't served an active role yet this game. This pawn on g5 sticks out like a sore thumb. It would love to go back to g7. This is what you'll find, though, is oftentimes when you play strong opponents, for the most part, they're not going to make stupid pawn advances on their own accord. Okay, we found this exception with Aronian. People do it. But it's much better if you can provoke them into doing it. Now, this one, I think provoke is perhaps the wrong word, because it wasn't like, oh, I tempted him into, no, I forced him. He really did not have a choice. But you'll often find that even just making simple moves, like I've already talked about the Grunfeld or the dragon as examples where the bishop on g7 is sort of the pride and power of black's position. And a lot of these positions, white puts the bishop on g5 just to annoy the e7 pawn and provoke you into playing f6. At any moment, you can play f6 and send this bishop packing, but you've blocked your own bishop in. So this is all about provocation. Now, the way the game continued, black should have played c5 here. He needed to make counterplay in the center right away. And after takes, I should play king h1. f4 is coming next, and white has a dangerous initiative. It's important to point out, black can try to, his best thing to do here is to try to exchange a bunch of pieces. The fewer pieces are on the board, the less likely I am to mate him. The problem is what he really wants to do is play knight c6. And at this point, I can probably just give up on my attack and go pawn grabbing on a6. It's not a great pawn, but it's a pawn. I also could throw f4 if I wanted to. I gave some variation here, rook d8, and I wanted to take on d8 because I didn't want to let black play rook d1 and rook d8. So rook d8, and f4. Okay, I think black's position is quite dangerous. The game goes on. Black is not lost, but I think I would much prefer white. Instead, my opponent played b5, and I view this to be a strategically losing decision because after AB, and bishop b3, now it'll be very hard for black to get in c5 just because his b5 pawn is hanging. And if he cannot play c5 to open the position, then f4 is just going to come and it's going to be demolition. Game continued, knight d7, takes, f4. At this point, it's just so obvious. If black could play g5 to g7, he'd probably be basically fine here. I mean, but he can't. Now, at the time of the game, I was expecting him to just trade everything on f4 to try to alleviate some of the pressure and turtle up with bishop g6 and king g7 and sort of say, yes, my king side has been somewhat compromised, but it's not over. Now, the best move was, I believe, rook f6, king g7, e5, And I think h4, h5 is coming very quickly, and if black ever plays knight d5, I can take it and play bishop c2. This is what the computer gave. But important, what I came up with is not as good, but it's still pretty strong. I wanted to play rook h4 and attack this pawn. And there's always a key part of chess is whenever you have an advantage of some kind, in this case I have a dynamic advantage that black's king is simply unsafe. You should always be looking for opportunities to exchange one advantage for another if it becomes necessary. And what I had seen is after king d2, king g8, I can play queen d2, attacking this pawn. Now my queen is probably worse placed here after h5, and I can just forget my attack and clip this pawn on b5, pointing out that the knight on b4 is hanging. Now, after something like this, pretty unlikely black's going to get mated. The bishop on g6 is a good defender and all that, and my rook on h4 is a little misplaced, but I'm up a very healthy pawn. And there's not anything great for black to do. I'm solid, and I'm a clean pawn up. So this was my intention. I think the computer's way is stronger. But instead, my opponents tried to keep more pieces on the board with bishop e7, but then we sort of see that now he's really missing this pawn on g7, both because I was able to open the f-file for my rook and because his king now has no cover. I played bishop e5, and it turns out, weirdly enough, black is just completely incapable of stopping this basic threat of bishop f6 followed by like queen h5 taking on g5. He tried f6 himself, but this allows white to bring more pieces into the attack. Does anybody see a good candidate move? Oh, your bishop is attacked. Do you want to move him away, or should we threaten something bigger?
Queen g4.
Yeah, queen g4 is absolutely crushing. This pawn on e6 is under attack. Black does not have time to take my bishop because if bishop takes e6 check, when his queen will be lost. The only way to defend this pawn is king f7, which fails for I don't know how many reasons, but I think the easiest is probably bishop takes f6 followed by e5, but queen takes g5 is more than enough. I mean, basically any sensible move will win for white. Instead, my opponent tried knight d5, which was sort of, this is the move of a desperate man, but still white has to be reasonably precise. Like, for example, I saw some funny trickery. My first instinct was to play knight takes d5, cd5, bishop d5. But now, unfortunately, he can play f5, breaking the pin on the e6 pawn. And next up, he'll take on d5. And this one, I had to calculate reasonably precisely, but it's still pretty straightforward. I just traded one advantage for another. I played ed5. After fe, I'm probably not going to mate anymore because I lost my bishop, which was the key attacking piece. But after dc6, black is going to lose a ton of material. If he takes my pawn back, I will go bishop takes e6 check and bishop d5. I'm taking the rook in the corner, and I'm going to be like up an exchange in 2 pawns, and black's king's still pretty open. So instead, he tried rook takes f1, rook takes f1, queen takes d4, and black can rejoice because the queens came off, but unfortunately for him, my c6 pawn immediately decides the game. It just becomes a queen. So that was sort of another one of those cases of exchanging one advantage for another. So obviously there's a lot more to it than just this, and that's why I hope you will buy this lovely book and learn more about it. But I go into great detail on all these topics, and I'm offering a lot of guidelines as to how to avoid making these kinds of poor decisions with your own pawns, as well as how to provoke your opponent's pawns forward. Now, while the major premise of the book is pawns do not move backwards, there's a secondary part at the end, which is that pawns seldom move sideways. They move sideways when they capture. And a lot of the times you'll see positions where, let's say your queen has just been taken, and you're thinking, or someone's thinking, and it's because he's got like 4 different ways to take back the queen. And all of them lead to, and like, 2 of them will lead to different pawn structures because either pawn can take, or you can take with one of the pieces to leave the pawn structure as is. So in general, it's much harder to just expect your opponent to make unforced errors when talking about pawns moving sideways, because the only way that pawns move sideways is when they are taking one of your pieces. So unless you're habitually just placing pieces on squares where your opponent's pawns can take them, which I hope you're not doing, this is much more forceful in its nature. It's stuff where you are, for example, making a capture and then dragging your opponent's pawn sideways when they have to recapture. There's a lot of typical themes like this. For example, anybody here play the Sicilian defense? Just a few people. Okay, anyone play against the Sicilian defense? Yeah, a bunch of people. Okay, so anyone who's played either side of the Sicilian defense know there's one very typical motif that you'll see in just about every single variation, which is the exchange sacrifice rook takes c3. And the whole point of this is you're dragging a pawn sideways. to a square where it's much worse because it is doubled, it is weak, it is failing to control key squares. So there's also parts at the end of the book about pawns moving sideways, specifically doubled pawns, and how they can fail to make a passed pawn, or they can fail to fight for a key square. But it's one thing to know about these topics, it's another one to play them well. And it's my goal that that this book will help the readers learn to control these pawn plays a bit better, because I found this topic has been largely neglected. I've seen a lot of books on pawn structures, about specific pawn structures, about mobilizing passed pawns or pawn endgames, things like this. But I've never actually seen one that talks specifically about should you push your pawns or not, or should you double your pawns or not. And I've offered a lot of guidelines to help people out. In any case, we've been going for almost 40 minutes. So what I'd like to do for the last part of the session, first I would like to open it up to general question and answer. You can ask me about me, my book, anything you'd like. So I'd like to do that, and then I will be selling the book as well as signing it for anyone who would like. So, well, it's a funny story. I didn't really want to write a book at first, but Jacob made a bet with me, and if I lost the bet, I'd have to write the book. I didn't, but and it was his part of the bet. It's his business. It was a one-sided bet. If he achieves his goal, I have to write the book. He didn't quite get there. I mean, he certainly will based on his progress. But at some point, I chose to do it voluntarily, not because I thought, oh, I'm going to have to do it soon when Jacob achieves his goal. But I had some time on my hands. My only tournament planned for the fall of 2017 was the World Cup, which unfortunately I did not qualify for, which I was not happy about. And just to keep myself from jumping off a bridge or whatever, I had to keep myself busy, so I thought writing a book would be a good idea. In addition, I largely wrote the book for selfish reasons. I chose a topic that I felt I did not understand that well myself, and I wanted to have an opportunity to look at it in more detail and try to learn from. And my hope is and I'd certainly learn from writing this book, and my hope is if I can learn from it, you can learn from it too. It would be a nice side effect if the results of my studies are a lot of people are able to improve their chess based on what I've presented. After this last tournament, I am 2671 FIDE. I peaked out at 2686 live, or like some 60-ish in the world, 59, something like that. That's a very high rating. I'm very good at chess, but there's a long way to go. And the better if there's one thing that has never changed in my life, is that the better I get at chess, the more I realize there is to learn. If you only are playing from one skill set, you're not going to be a very good chess player. Chess is a large subset of a lot of things. It is going to be memory, understanding, positional feel, concrete calculation, opening preparation, endgame study. It's basically, chess is not soccer. In soccer, if you cannot catch a ball with your hands but you're good at kicking it with your feet, that's great. You don't have to be a goalie. In chess, you have to play every position that comes in front of you, and you have to have all the tools at your disposal to play well. So I try to not play positionally or tactically. I try to play the way the position demands that I play. Well, I don't know. I'm good. I'm on the U.S. Olympic team. I've won gold medals with them, but there's still quite a gap between me and the best players in the world. Yes. Well, if you wonder how we had such a better result, we just had better players. I mean, the teams we sent to Baku were unquestionably by far the strongest American teams we ever had. I mean, I was like world number 59, I think, at the time, which in a lot of years would be board 1 for the United States of America. In this case, it was board 4. I was, maybe you've got someone who's going to be a very decent, like well above average board 1 playing board 4. So we just had a stronger team. As for our team dynamic, we got along fine. Mostly we just focused on our own games. We had our coach and captain to help us. I know I don't want to say I didn't care, because obviously I did, but when I was watching my teammates play, I was not bothering to think about their games at all. I was just trying to focus on my own, because I felt that the best thing I could do for the team as playing board 4 as the lowest rated player was to focus on my own game and play as well as I can, and have faith that whatever the evaluation of the positions next to me are, my teammates will play them to the best of their ability and get the points they deserve. And although I must say it's easier to have faith in your teammates when they're like numbers 2, 3, and 6 in the world. So it's easier to do it then than it is when they're, say, one of your peers who makes a lot of mistakes just like you do. Right. So the question about age and how to improve is a very good one, just because every age has assets and liabilities. You know, your brain starts slowing down a lot younger than most people want to admit. It certainly started slowing down for me. I'm fully aware there's things I could do when I was 18 or 20 that I can't do now. Now, in most fields, just the sort of slowing down of your sheer brain power is, you know, completely overwritten by the extra experience and knowledge you've had from, you know, your years of study or work. That's why you see, like, you know, the best doctors or lawyers, they're not like, you know, 20-year-old kids, they're experienced ones. But in chess, which is so much about brute force, that's something that slows down. When you're older, you tend to have more experience, things like this. But like I said, chess is not soccer. You have to do everything. I've always believed that you have to be well-rounded to be a good chess player. If you have clear weaknesses, especially if you have a bunch of games in the database that people can see, a well-rounded opponent will look you up, figure out where you're not playing well, and they will attack you. If you're an older player who's struggling with memory, do memory stuff. You know, take memory quizzes, play blindfold chess, try to remember where your pieces are. If you're struggling with energy levels, go to the gym, make sure you're fit. These are problems that older players will face more than younger players. Younger players might face problems. I don't know this rook endgame because I haven't studied it yet. I just haven't had time to. So in general, I think identifying the weaknesses in your game, and there is certainly a trend of what kind of weaknesses usually show up with age, although every player is individual and some age better than others and in different ways. So that would be my recommendation. I believe I'm a reasonably well-rounded player. I'm trying to study a bit of everything, which is sort of, I don't know if that's totally efficient, but at the same time, if you believe you're well-rounded, you don't want to get like much stronger at one thing, win a few games, and it's like, oh, okay, he's good at that. Let's not do that anymore. I don't really know what's between me and, you know, the truly elite in the world, you know, the guys in the top 10 or top 5. If I did, maybe I would be there. I don't know. So I try to study a bit of everything, but also it helps that I'm a full-time professional chess player. I have the time to do so. It's easier for me to do that than for someone who has a 9-to-5 and a bunch of kids. It's people who have actual responsibilities and can't just study chess all day. It's much harder for them to. And so for people like that in the real world, they have to compartmentalize their time appropriately. While for me, I have much more to devote, so I can study a bit of everything. My favorite player to work with, probably the last player I actually played with yesterday. I really enjoy working with my friend Surya Ganguly. He's a very good analyst. I've spent some time in India, and I really there's a very, I mean, India is an enormous place with a ton of different people and different cultures, but I definitely sort of sense an overarching kind of culture to the way they approach chess improvement that I really, really like. And I've found that working with Indian players has been very helpful, and Surya is the one I've worked with the most. And he's also the one who's closest in rating to me. We're very close. But I'd also like to point out exactly what happens when I play with Surya, because a lot of people, when they play with their friends, you know, they make quick draws and go home. And while the two of us, we know each other's game inside and out, we work hard. You know, look, we were the last ones in the dungeon there playing. We played 62 moves. The whole room was empty by the time we were done duking it out. When you're actually at the board, there's no love lost. My least favorite player to be around. I'm told you shouldn't say bad things about other people behind their back, so I'm not going to do that, even if it's technically not behind their back if they can see it. But that one I'll rather just keep to myself. There are definitely people I don't like. I'll leave it at that. All right, so it looks like we've got like just 10 minutes left. So I'd like to just spend the last bit of the time selling the books to whoever would like. $40 cash preferred, just because I have a hard time taking credit cards, and I'm happy to sign them. Yeah, thanks everyone for coming to my lecture.